Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you realize that I am not Chris Jepson. I'm Stephanie George. I'm a board member. I'm the secretary of the Orange County Historical Society. Chris, unfortunately, is under the weather tonight, so he sends his regards. He's very disappointed that he can't be here. But if you've never been to Authors Night, what this forum allows for is to showcase those authors who have written about some aspect of Orange County history. And sometimes they're newly published books, sometimes they were published a few years ago, but our dates didn't necessarily coordinate with them attending. So tonight we have 6 little talks focused on a lot of different topics. And if you haven't been here, what we do is we go round robin. We'll have each speaker come up. They'll have about 5 minutes to talk about their book or their research or maybe a tidbit that they found interesting while they were working on their research. And then afterwards, okay, yeah. And then afterwards, you'll have an opportunity to stop by each of their tables and speak with them if you have any questions. And certainly we encourage you to support our authors by purchasing their books. So as usual, please silence your cell phones, just as a courtesy to those sitting around you and also the speakers who are here. And a very quick note about next month. One of our favorite speakers, Eric Plunkett, will be back next month to talk about some of the Native Americans, specifically vis-a-vis the San Juan Capistrano mission. So, as always, Eric does an incredible job of doing research and writing. He's a very engaging speaker, so we encourage you to put that on your calendar now. We know December is always a very busy month. So, and then again, we have refreshments in the back. And if you are so moved, at the end of the evening, after you've spoken with the authors, if you can just help with maybe moving some of the chairs around, putting up tables, et cetera, because oftentimes there are several of us old and decrepit and handicapped people trying to do the job. So I would appreciate that. So our first author tonight is Linda Rattner Nunn. And she has done a series of interviews that was the culmination of her book, A Place of Our Future, Building a Jewish Community in Yorba Linda. And I think at this point, I will say up front that she has very few copies left, and actually none for sale this evening. But she spoke with her editor, and we got a PDF copy of her book, and it is currently up on our website that you can download and read for free. So with that, Linda, why don't you come on up?
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I also have copies on Amazon if somebody wants to buy them.
Oh, okay.
So, my name is Linda Rattner Nunn, and before I talk about my book, I'd like to describe why I decided to write this book. When we first moved to Yorba Linda in 1989, we discovered a small rural town. The main street of Yorba Linda Boulevard ran east to west, and it only was a very short street, and at the end of the street there was a fence, a chain link fence, and then it was all gravel. So it wasn't very big, it was very rural. And I remember driving down Yorba Linda Boulevard, and there was a McDonald's, and it had a hitching post, and people would take their horses and hitch their horses up in front of McDonald's. It was that rural that we had we still have horse trails, but you just don't see very many horses anymore. There were many old houses from the 1920s that were built in the city, and they were occupied mostly by farmers. In fact, there was one old yellow farmhouse on Yorba Linda Boulevard that was built about 100 feet away from the front street. And I was curious about it. And there was a sign that said, "Welcome to Yorba Linda Synagogue." So I went inside this little house, and there was a small living room, a dining room, and a tiny kitchen on the first floor. And I'll never forget the rickety old wooden staircase that climbed up to the second floor. So I met the rabbi, and I asked him what he was doing in this old yellow house. And he said he had an idea to build a new Jewish community house of worship in North Orange County. There was nothing like it anywhere in North Orange County. So I was curious about the people that attended, and I always have loved history. So as he was working on this project, I wanted to document the steps to get to the place where he is now. So he had this idea that he wanted to build an 8,000 square foot sanctuary right on the main street. He didn't have any money whatsoever, but he just had this idea. So he said that if he built a sanctuary, then people would come. David Eliezer is a great motivational speaker, and he asked some friends to talk to other friends, and they helped him to get started. In 1986, he had to ask the Yorba Linda Building Department to change the zoning from residential to commercial, and that wasn't easy because the Yorba Linda Building Department didn't want to change it to a commercial site. But in 1995, we started phase one by demolishing that lovely old yellow farmhouse that I have so many memories of. And I have pictures in my book here of, let's see if I can find them. This is the first, we first demolished the house, and it was all dirt lot. Figured 200 feet of dirt lot, nothing on it. And he started off by 1997, we had a groundbreaking ceremony and just started taking our shovels and digging to start the wood frame. And we started with a wood frame, and I've got pictures in here. In fact, I took photographs myself of the progress. Started from a dirt lot, and we built the first wood frame for the building. That's how it started. And I had my doubts if we're going to ever have anything, but he believed that there would be something. So he got an old tractor, and he started demolishing the ground, and we started building. Eventually, we built the first sanctuary. It looks like this. If you drive down Yorba Linda Boulevard, you'll see it. It's a white building like this, and that's how we got started. As for my book, I met a lot of people that attended, and I wanted to know what brought people from all over the world to this little tiny community in Yorba Linda. It was very strange. So I interviewed several people, and I was searching for people with backgrounds that were not from Yorba Linda, that were not from Orange County. And the people that came in that were members, for example, was Sam Eiferman. He came from the Bronx in New York City. He was one of our first members, and he met Rabbi Eliezer at a class and followed him Rabbi Eliezer would hold classes at Hughes Aircraft. I don't know if you remember Hughes Aircraft back in those days. And he would hold a class there, and a lot of people would attend. So he brought him over to Yorba Linda, and he said, we're going to build this big, gigantic sanctuary on this vacant lot. Another couple was Max and Parvin Rafi. They came all the way from Shushan, Iran, and their ancestors dated all the way back to Babylon. After the revolution, he came to this country to work for Hughes Aircraft, and Rabbi Eliezer would hold classes there at lunch and for people who wanted to learn together. Another person was Nate Kavetny. He came from Kiev, Russia. And after the Suez Canal War, he said he wanted to come to America to become an electrical engineer. His wife, Aurelia, was born in Port Said, Egypt, but it wasn't safe to live there. So they got married and came to America. All over the world. Another couple was Robert and Brenda Morton. They were born in Johannesburg, South Africa. Dr. Morton got a residency in radiology at Columbia University in New York and moved to America. He then completed his training in radiology here in Orange County, and of course, he wanted to attend too. The person that I think was the most amazing person was Stanley Siegel. He was a large man with a deep, booming voice that commanded a lot of respect. He was very intellectual and dynamic, and he sang songs and read prayers for us for the community. He was from Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut, and he moved with his wife and family to Orange County, specifically to Yorba Linda. His daughter was getting married, and she was looking for a place to get married, and she found Rabbi Eliezer. So people came from all over the world, and this intrigued me about their story. The main reason that the congregation has grown to become so big and have so many members is because of the vision of Rabbi Eliezer. He believed his mission in life was to bring people together. He has worked tirelessly to achieve this dream. And from that small farmhouse that he started, it has grown to a sanctuary of 12,000 square foot complex with a separate sanctuary, social hall, an education building, and an office complex. He has ambition and charisma, and he believed that he had what people were looking for. So I wrote their stories. If you're interested.
Our next speaker is Larry Strother. Basically, the story of Seal Beach from the port and the summer retreat of Anaheim Landing to an early aviation and motion pictures to a den of gambling, speakeasies and brothels, and finally to a quiet residential beach town is the subject of his book, Seal Beach, A Brief History. Larry.
Thank you very much. It's like I have the temerity to actually think I can read what I wrote here to write to getting old. So anyway, my name is Larry Strother. I write books about cities with no bookstores. So a very good business model. Anyway, Seal Beach I started writing about it because it's really a very unique, distinct city. Has many number ones. It actually had the first airport in Orange County, 1916. When they built the Joy Zone, they had stunt pilots, and they built it's a tent hangar down by the 3rd Street, and they had the runway on the beach. And one of the big things was they took off over the pier when they did that. And then they would write breathlessly about how they almost didn't make it, all the while trying to get people to come back in. Also had the first female mayor, Jessie Reed, 1942. First surfing competition in the country, 1914. It was a guy named Guy M. Rush was a real estate agent who tried to rescue the Bayside Land Company, and so he optioned the whole property of Seal Beach. and which was a failed real estate development. And so anyway, what they did was they had a special day for companies, and they had Barker Brothers Furniture Days, and they all came down to Seal Beach, and the first competition was you had to paddle out to the buoy, like a half mile out, and then ride the wave back in, whoever was back first. That was the first competition. They've changed it a little bit since then. But they also had the first two national surfing champs, Jack and Mike Haley in 1959 and 1960. It was called by federal prohibition agents in 1923 the wettest spot in California. So that's the wettest. That's another number one. It's superlative. There was more gambling. There was a grand jury statement in Orange County said they never would arrest anybody. I mean, every time they arrested them, it always went to municipal court because it was considered a misdemeanor. And since everybody in Seal Beach was related to somebody who worked for the gamblers, they never convicted them. So, but they had a ton of gambling ships. You hear about Santa Monica had gambling ships. Santa Monica had only 2 or 3 ships. The majority of the ships were down in Long Beach and Seal Beach because it's right in the Orange County line. And so if the cops came from LA County, well, we're in Seal Beach, Orange County right here. If they busted them in Orange County, they said, well, we're going to Seal Beach. Well, they never convict us anyway, so. And it was a lot cheaper to bribe a 3-man police department as opposed to a 200-man police department. Anyway, it's also Seal Beach Leisure World, first self-contained senior citizen community in the country. By self-contained, it had storage within the property. It had, hospitals. It had, everything you needed was in that community. That was the first one. So, and then Ross Cortese obviously did much bigger ones down in Leisure World down in Laguna. Anyway, how did I come to write the book? It's like I was born in San Francisco, which has no, other than that's the original Bay City, nothing else there. But my first gigs were I worked for my dad. He was a builder, so I always kind of liked building. But I hated actually building because you had to get down on your knees and nail off floors and all the jobs that my dad didn't want to do, and so he'd have me do it during the summer when I was a young kid. So I got into writing, and I wrote for newspapers, and then I ended up writing comedy. I moved to LA, and I wrote for a lot of TV shows, and that's a good qualification for writing histories. So anyway, after a number of years, my wife wanted to move back. She grew up in Rossmore. So she wanted to move back because she was the only daughter and her parents were getting elderly. And the schools are a lot cheaper and free and better. So we moved to Rossmore, and after about 4 years, I'm going, this drive stinks. So quit doing that, and I started writing local history books. I had some money saved up. And you start talking to all the people in the area, and you talk to the old timers, and all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, if John's telling the truth, then Joe's lying. Or if Joe's telling the truth, John's lying. So I figured I'd start doing some really serious research. And what I found out is the area needed serious research. Truth was not that important, but they needed serious research. So I started doing that, and I ended up writing a book on Los Alamitos and Rossmore. That went out. It was called, same company. It wasn't Arcadia at the time. It was History Press. And so they called it A Brief History of Los Alamitos and Rossmore. And one critic said, it's a great book. The only thing better would be a briefer history of Los Alamitos and Rossmore. And that happened to be my wife, who was the critic. Anyway, because of that, you can't tell the community, or you can't tell the history of that area without including Seal Beach, because it's all one community separated by some governments who think they actually control their lives and they don't. So I started doing the Seal Beach history right before the 100th anniversary. And the great thing about the 100th anniversary is the people who could dispute me were all dead. So always an advantage to something. Anyway, started doing that and had a good time writing Seal Beach just because there's so much interesting about it. And so you meet a lot of people. And one of the things I wanted to get down was there's a lot of people who they would, I don't have time to write the history down. I don't have time to write my memories down. So I figured if I got it down on paper, they're going to say, you got it wrong. This is what happened. So that's what happened. I've learned a lot from doing it, and that was one of the reasons for doing it. Anyway, that's it. So I just bought a box of books. I haven't bought one in a while, so if you want to help me get rid of them, make my wife happy so there's no dust collecting around the house, I'll be over there at that table. So thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Our next author, Paul Carter, is someone who actually I met while working at Cal State Fullerton. Cal State Fullerton has a very extensive collection of oral histories with people who knew Richard Nixon. And as we know, there have been many, many books written about Watergate, but Paul really delved into who Nixon was as a person vis-a-vis California. So in his book, Richard Nixon, California Native Son, Paul Carter challenges common conceptions of our 37th president and talks about the people and the places and the experiences that shaped our most famous Orange Countian. Paul?
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm sorry Chris isn't here because he really helped me very early on in some of my research. And basically when I was at Cal State Fullerton, I started volunteering at the Nixon Library. I was studying political science, and I volunteered because I thought it'd be interesting. I wasn't what you would consider pro-Nixon at the time. I was basically ambivalent to him. The reality is I didn't have a dog in the fight over whether or not Richard Nixon's a good guy or a bad guy, or if he liked his presidency or he didn't. I was 9 years old when he resigned. I didn't even know what a president was back then. And I ended up meeting him 4 times when I was volunteering at his library. And what really struck me was this dichotomy between the public image and the private man. He was incredibly welcoming and warm and easy to talk to and just exceedingly friendly. And that dichotomy always stuck with me. I graduated Cal State Florida and went to law school, started developing a law practice, got married, had kids, did everything everyone else does in life. And fast forward 20 years, about to 2009, and I was with the mayor of Whittier. And I just was making small talk. And I said to him, you must have all the places in Whittier where Nixon lived, worked, and played designated. And he scratched his head and he looked at me and he said, we kind of lost track of all that. And I was like, well, he was the president of the United States, and the only one from California. And I decided right then and there to make a map of Richard Nixon's life in Southern California. And I thought it would take 6 months. I thought it'd be a no-brainer. I made the map, and they sell it at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library gift shop. But what Stephanie pointed out, I learned that there was 200 oral histories at Cal State Fullerton from Nixon's intimates and friends that grew up with him. And I learned that Whittier College had another 400 of those oral histories. And I was able to persuade Stephanie and Whittier College to give me copies of all those. It was 10,000 pages of oral histories. And I started going through them because I wanted to know, where does a kid go in 1926 on a date in Whittier? What was it like to be born in 1913 in Yorba Linda? What did the people say Yorba Linda was like, in 1920 when 350 people lived there? And I was struck when I was reading these oral histories that everybody was describing the man that I had met. And it was reinforcing that dichotomy that always struck me about the private man. And it was really a book that was screaming to be written. And so I decided to do a biography about Richard Nixon, and the way I approached it is Watergate sucks the oxygen out of the room every time you talk about Richard Nixon. And I started focusing on Richard Nixon, and I thought, okay, well, he was born in Yorba Linda, he's raised in Whittier, he went to college, and he went to Fullerton High School, Whittier High School, Whittier College, he went to Duke, but then he came back, he practiced law here, he went to World War II, he came back, he was a congressman here, then he was a United States Senator here, he was vice president, then he came back, he practiced law here, he then went to New York, and then he was elected president. Then he came back and he had the Western White House. Then he resigned and he stayed in San Clemente 5.5 years to the day from his resignation. And then he went back to New York. And then when he ultimately died, he was born, he was buried steps away from where he was born in Yorba Linda. So I could tell this story of his life full circle from birth to death, California-centric. I don't really care what the politics were because I want to talk about the man. And all of the people in Southern California that had incredible influences on his life and incredibly long-standing, loyal relationships, all about this person that is a story that's never been told. And there's a couple of things about the book that I'm really pleased about. Number one, Nixon said in an interview in 1983 that anyone that would write about him would never win any awards if they wrote anything positive, although it would make for interesting history. And my book was published 40 years after he said that and 30 years after he died. And I received the Eric Hoffer Award for Biography of the Year for 2023. I received the Forward Indies Gold Award for Biography. I received the America's Best Books Gold Biography of the Year. So it's just the opposite of what Nixon thought. You know, a story about the man actually did receive awards, and I really look at the whole situation with Richard Nixon as we could talk about the Wizard of Oz. And we all know that story, the front ways, back ways. You know, I could call on anyone in this room and you could tell me any part of that movie and any part of that story. And we knew who was who and what was what, and we grew up that way, and we could just recite it chapter and verse. And then we saw Wicked, and it turned the whole thing on its head. And that's really kind of what my book does, because I humanize Richard Nixon, which is no one's ever done before. They've only demonized him. And so I humanize him and let you know what the actual person was like. And his daughter Tricia liked the book so much, she wrote the foreword. She's never written on her father before. And I do a bus tour on behalf of the Nixon Library through Whittier. If you'd ever like to come up and go on it, I'm happy to take you through there. I do social media. I'm happy to give you the address on it. And I'm really pleased because my favorite review of the book was a guy named Kurt Mills, who, I don't know if any of you know who he is, but he's the executive director of the American Conservative, and he's on CNN and different talk shows. And he wrote, this richly researched volume is not critical of the man Richard Nixon in the slightest, and it leaves the reader not minding. And it's because it's just about a guy. And it's really an all-American story about someone with a modest beginning, reaching the highest point, going through devastating lows, and then rebuilding his life, and what that guy was like. And so I have copies. They're $30 each. I'm happy to talk to anyone about him on any topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Chris Nichols. Perhaps you know his name associated with Disneyland, Tiki, and now he has written a book about perhaps America's second favorite pastime, bowling. So let him get up, and he will be the best person to talk about mid-century modern bowling alleys. Chris.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Chris Nichols. I have been an editor at Los Angeles Magazine for the last 24 years. We have this magazine, Orange Coast, down here you might be familiar with. But this one has been around since 1960, and I write a column on the back page where I answer questions about things that people find on the street, history of LA, and some Little Orange County. And so I'm always sniffing around for neat stories. I got involved in historic preservation as a teenager. Walking home from school, I saw this abandoned building that caught my attention, and it was a futuristic mid-century building falling into ruin, and I couldn't understand how that could happen as a teenager, because it's the future and it should be sparkly and new, but it was rotten and falling apart. And I got this book, Googie, for, I think it was Christmas when I was maybe 16, and I called the author out of the phone book, Alan Hess, who lived in Saddleback Valley at the time. And Alan became my mentor and taught me everything. Some dorky kid calling you out of the phone book is not always going to get the best reaction, but man, he really did, and it changed my life. So I dedicated myself to learning everything about this kind of architecture and media, and I was lucky enough to be doing it at a time when a lot of these original architects were still around from the 50s and 60s. And so I got to know some of my heroes, and when you're studying art history of 500 years ago, you don't have that luxury. So it was pretty great. So I grew up out in the San Gabriel Valley, and our local bowling center was the Covina Bowl. I don't know if anybody ever heard of that one. It was a really great one. And it was there from 1956 until about 6 or 7 years ago when it closed. And when it closed, before it closed, we got real nervous that it was going to come down. It was one of the best examples of this kind of really forward, advanced, modernist, dramatic architecture that gets me real excited. And so I knew it was in really, really great condition too. So horrible to see it close. A group of us, we had the LA Conservancy Modern Committee for many decades. We did a state landmark nomination for it. It became a state landmark. Whoopee! A great Googie building become a state landmark is kind of a rare thing. And so then it went into the whole, can the developer save it? What will they do? What will they build? And they ended up building 1 billion condos behind it, but they did a beautiful job preserving the main character-defining features of the building. So I did a museum exhibition at the Architecture and Design Museum on Wilshire Boulevard, and about this genre. And I didn't really even realize it was such a thing, that there was this whole species of these crazy buildings that housed these bowling centers. And this book is about art and architecture and music and food and lounge acts and very little about bowling. But it goes all through Southern California, because this is really where it changed from a greasy back lane saloon sport into something for the whole family, and something that was respectable, and something that was elegant. And it's way more James Bond than John Goodman, the kind of the vibe they were going for at this brief period when there was this incredible war for spending money, for building the most lavish, like an arms race to build the most lavish and incredible and complicated entertainment center, where you would have live music, you would have a Las Vegas style showrooms, you would have a fine dining restaurant, you'd have free childcare, which apparently didn't exist before this, a lot of these people are telling me. And then it became kind of a fad thing for celebrities like Barbara Eden from My Dream of Jeannie built one. Harold Lloyd was a big proponent of bowling and promoted it. A bunch of sports stars, once they turned, 30 and you can't be in professional sports anymore, they would invest in these bowling centers. So you had all over the country, you had big name sports people, you had actors, you had just people with a lot of sway and a lot of money dumping untold millions into building these crazy palaces of entertainment. And the story hadn't been told, and finding adults from the 1950s is a little tough these days. So doing first-person interviews was kind of my main source, but then finding 200 pictures that are artful and color and period was really hard. And I'm a really good picture researcher, and it took 10 years to make this happen. And so Angel City Press, which is now part of the LA Public Library, published it, so thank you to them. And the architect, Gordon Powers, was kind of the lead star of this book. He was in Seal Beach. We've got the great Anaheim Bowl, which is no longer with us, which is where bawdy 1950s singing sensation Rusty Warren came and did her blue comedy records, recorded them there. Futurama Lane's Wonder Bowl in Anaheim, which was the great pinnacle of it all, where they just shoveled money into building these crazy places, and it had all kinds of got in all kinds of legal trouble at the end there, and the whole industry came crashing down in 1962, and then it's spent the last 60 years drying up and blowing away. But today, there's a new wave of new luxury bowling. It's still, get this, it's still the #1 participatory sport in America. That's what they tell me. So, you go to a football game, you're not going to grab the ball, but if you go to a bowling alley, you're probably going to grab the ball and play. And a beer. Except it would have been a really classy martini in 1962. But, so it's just about this little moment, this little sparkling moment when everything was trying really hard to be tomorrow. And it's inspiring, and I love it. And so I wrote this book. So thank you very much.
Well, our next speaker, Tim Beer, is here to represent a author who unfortunately passed away in 2021. David Crawley actually wrote a book called The United States Naval Air Station, Lighter Than Air, Santa Ana, California. And I think there's been a lot of interest in this since we just passed the 1-year anniversary of one of those lighter than air stations burning to the ground. So Tim is here to speak about the book, and luckily it's been republished, so there are plenty of copies right now. Tim, thanks.
Just for the record, it's Zier. It rhymes with beer. Yeah, so Chris Jepson asked me, because of the heightened interest, because of the fire, he asked me if I would come represent the Historical Society and talk about this book. And so David Crawley was a Navy veteran. He served 2 tours on a destroyer during the Vietnam conflict. And then after he was discharged in 1968, he started working as a civilian for the Department of Defense. And he worked at both the Lighter Than Air Base and also MCAS El Toro. And then when he retired in 2010, he wrote this book, and the Historical Society published it. And I've been working as a docent in the Tustin Museum for the last 4 years. And there's like not a day goes by that I'm in there that somebody doesn't come in and have questions and show an interest in the hangars. People are fascinated. And I still use the plural. It's hard not to use the plural. I know there's only one left, but I'm just so used to doing that. But they'll come in and ask questions. And we have a continuously running slideshow on one of the big screens in the museum of the base, and most of the pictures of it are from this book. But I tell them, if you really, really have an interest and you want to know, then get this book, because it's a great comprehensive history of the base. It starts from the time that it was a bean field owned by James Irvine all the way to the decommissioning and closing down of the base in 1999. And if you want to know how many board feet of lumber or how many tons of nuts and bolts went into the hangars, it's in this book, you know. There's all kind of great anecdotes about some of the missions that the blimps flew, or later on the helicopters. He wrote about the relationship between the base and the surrounding communities. And one of my favorite stories is, I guess there were still a number of turkey farms around the area in the 50s. And every now and then when the helicopters would go over, these turkeys would panic and all run into one corner and smother themselves, and a bunch of the turkeys. And then the farmers would call the base commander then and complain, as though the commander had any control over the behavior of a turkey. But it's just full of great stories, chock full of pictures, diagrams. It's by far our best-selling book in our museum gift shop. We've shipped it out to men and women who served at the base, and they're now living all over the country. It's just a great book. I'd recommend it to anybody that has an interest in it. And we're actually we're having a sale. It's normally $25. We're selling it tonight for $20. And somebody earlier said, "Oh, it must be a fire sale." And I guess I'm slow. It took me a second to get the pun, but anyway, yeah, we're over here. If you have any interest in it, this is, until something else comes along, this is the definitive book on the LTA base. So, thank you.
And certainly, our final author is Roy Stevenson, who, although his book covers a great amount of history of Yorba Linda, it focuses and is titled Building Yorba Linda from Scratch, 1973 to 2001, and basically talks about the community's development and how the citizens decided to incorporate as a city. Roy.
Well, I really appreciate being invited to a historical society meeting. I don't consider myself an author per se, but this book I wrote really documents a lot of things that happened in Yorba Linda between 1973, and 2001, when I was there for 28 years. The city, when it had incorporated in 1962, wanted to remain small, and so they didn't have a property tax. They were going to run the city using volunteers. totally. A volunteer fire department, they use the county sheriff. The first budget they put together was $300,000 total. And that was in 1973. I mean, in 1962. In 1973, I was working in my front yard. I lived in Villa Park for a number of years. Was a 50-year resident of Orange County. Raised my family here. They went to Villa Park High School in the Orange County School District. And a woman pulls up in front of my house, the end of my cul-de-sac. She gets out of the car and introduces herself as Carolyn Ewing. She says, I'm the mayor of Yorba Linda. Well, that's nice. You know, here I am in my scrubby clothes and wiped my dirty hand, shook her hand. And she says, well, I've heard pretty good things about you. You seem to know a little bit about city engineering. And I did, still do. And she said, but we would like you to become our city engineer. And I said, okay, because I was a consultant, another client, why not? She says, well, I want you to come next Tuesday to a council closed session. We're going to interview you. Got interviewed. They hired me on the spot. They said, you start Monday. They had just hired a new city manager by the name of Art Simonian. He'd come from the city of Carpinteria. He actually had a planning background. He was one of their first original hires, but there was two or three other part-time people working at the city. And Art says, well, we've got a challenge here. He didn't know me from anything. He says, we don't have any money, but we'll put a budget together. So he pulls out this 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and we start writing down things we needed to do. And I said, well, first of all, what's our revenue? Well, by then, the revenue had grown. It had gone from $300,000 to $700,000. So we had $700,000 to work with. And don't forget, that covers police and fire and public works and all the other things. The city of 5 square miles, population around 7,000 at that time. But they were experiencing growth, infill growth. There was a lot of vacant land. The largest lot you could, that you had to build was a half acre. Anything less than that was considered high density. So this was a low density city in 1973. So we started infilling. And so when we did that and started working with the developers, revenue started coming in. So then we got into the point where we're running out of land in this little 5 square mile area, and we started looking at potential annexations. Because Yorba Linda's boundary was basically Rose Drive on the west and Fairmont Boulevard on the east, the river on the south, the state park on the north, but a lot of vacant land out east. There was 5 or 6 ranches out there, large ranches. And so we began the annexation process. And that was really the beginning of the growth of Yorba Linda. That was occurring probably in the middle to late 80s. And so we grew. But we still had financial restrictions. We still had no property tax at that time in the 80s. So the city manager went on up to Sacramento and said, it was right about the time Prop 13 came about, and there was a lot of financial machinations going on, but we said, we need a property tax. You know, if any of you ever knew Bill Campbell, he lived in Villa Park, he was a neighbor of mine, we went to the same church. Bill says, well, what do you need? We'd like to get $1 million. Okay, I'll see what I can do. And so they went back and forth, Art Simonian, the assistant city manager, and making these trips up to Sacramento. One morning he walks in my office, and by the way, I was always a consultant to the city. I was not a city employee. but because I was doing other cities, I did Seal Beach, Los Al, set up the city of Mission Viejo when it incorporated Laguna Hills, Laguna Beach, was very involved in the toll roads, etc. But he comes up with a big smile on his face, and I said, "What are you grinning about? He'd always come in about 8:30 and had a cup of coffee." And he says, "Well, we just got special legislation passed to get a property tax. It was $1 million. Today, that legislation, the city gets around 25 to 30 million. I don't know the exact number. I've been gone for 20-some years. By the way, I wrote this book 20-some years after I'd left the city, all from my memory. So I may not be an author, but I'm very historic. I can, through my age and the time that I worked here, and I know a lot about what went on in other agencies here in Orange County. And so that was really the beginning of the explosion of the growth of Yorba Linda, was when that property tax came in. The other is when we basically finessed the city of Anaheim and were able to acquire the Savvy Ranch property because the city had no sales tax revenue. Didn't have any, it was all residential. But Savvy Ranch was a good opportunity to get some sales tax revenue. We ended up now, I talked to the city manager a couple of years ago, it's about $6 million a year. So going from this no property tax in '73 to now we're into, the 80s in that area, all of a sudden we've got $20–30 million. We can actually hire some people to do some things. But that's when we said, we really got to figure out a way to develop the east side of Yorba Linda. How are we going to do that? So we did something that many people told us we could not do. Attorneys told us you cannot do. We formed a redevelopment agency on raw land. That's not what redevelopment agencies were for. But it was right before redevelopment agencies went away in California. But by doing the redevelopment agency as a background of financing, we were able to do other tax type of revenue producing to build, for example, the Gypsum Canyon Bridge. That was a $27 million bridge. But anyway, when I left the city, I'd been gone for a long time. I talked to many people, and I told them all these stories, and they said, "Well, we didn't know that." And so I said, during COVID starting, I said, I'm going to finally document it. I really did it to honor the city manager because he did a great job of leadership. And so this book I wrote is not even for sale. I'm giving what I have here away. But it was really to document what happened because there were many untold stories, including the Nixon story, which is I tell in there. So anyway, I hope you all enjoy reading of the untold stories of the building Yorba Linda from scratch. All right?
All right, well, I think we've heard from everyone, so just a few quick reminders. Next month, our talk is going to be on some of the Guarreño and Mission San Juan Capistrano by Eric Plunkett. Help yourself to some refreshments. And please, if you have any questions of our authors, stop by, ask your questions, buy a book, and if you don't mind helping us with the chairs and the tables, that would be much appreciated. Thank you very much.